Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1118 for July 20th, 2025. Coming up in a few minutes.
I was really trying to find stuff that, wasn't in every whiskey book and really kind of, look at primary sources, turn over every rock, double check everything that we think we know about whiskey. And to be honest, it was an incredibly humbling process because so much of what I thought I knew or what I thought I knew was correct turned out actually not to be.
Noah Rothbaum spent the last 5 years researching his new book, The Whiskey Bible. And with a name like that, the challenge was there to get everything right. I'll talk with Noah on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast. Crafted with time, shaped by nature, perfected by generations. From Yamazaki to Hibiki to Hakushu, every drop of House of Suntory whiskey is a reflection of where it comes from. House of Suntory. This is Japanese whiskey.
Enjoy responsibly. Suntory Whiskey Single Malt and Blended Japanese Whiskey. 43% alcohol by volume. Copyright 2025 Suntory Global Spirits Import Company, Chicago, Illinois.
Hello, Gabriel Cardarella for Jewers. The 2025 release of our Jewers 19-Year-Old Champions Edition is a masterpiece, crafted for those who appreciate the finer things, whether on the course or in a glass. More on that in a moment.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Diageo parted ways with CEO Debra Crew this week. She lasted just 2 years on the job at a time when the drinks giant has been struggling to find its way. Crew resigned just 3 weeks before Diageo announces its fiscal year results. That job will be left to Chief Financial Officer Nick Jangiani, who's been tapped to serve as acting CEO and is a candidate for the permanent job. The U.S. and the European Union are still trying to work out a trade deal ahead of President Trump's deadline of August 1st. This week he threatened to hit EU exports to the U.S. with a 50% tariff if no deal is reached. EU officials have included American whiskeys on a list of goods that could be hit with retaliatory tariffs. A 50% tariff would be a disaster for the Irish whiskey industry, which depends on the U.S. for most of its sales. Meanwhile, Irish officials are likely to push back the introduction of health warnings on whiskeys and other alcoholic beverages until at least 2029. The law calling for mandatory warnings was enacted in 2023 and was to take effect starting next May. However, the labeling law is being seen as a trade barrier by the U.S., while other critics want to wait and see whether the EU makes warning labels mandatory in all 27 member countries. More setbacks for the struggling whiskey industry this week. Ireland's Killarney Brewing and Distilling closed its doors this week and went into receivership, while Kentucky's troubled Luca Mariano Distillery filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The distillery has been open for just a month. An update now on a story we brought you last week on Milam and Green Distillery's effort to raise money for Texas flooding victims. The distillery has now raised $7,000 so far, by donating 15% of its online and distillery sales. They've now extended that campaign until the end of July. Milam and Green is also partnering with Specs Liquors to donate $20 from every bottle sold to Texas Pets Alive, which is working to reunite lost pets with their owners. That program also runs through July 31st. Kentucky's Hidden Barn Distillery has a new master taster. Longtime bartender and bar owner Molly Wellman is joining the Hidden Barn team. She's taking the reins from former master blender Jackie Zykan, who stepped down earlier this summer and remains with the distillery as a consultant. The folks at the James B. Beam Distilling Company have been busy this week. They're releasing the second edition of Jim Beam Lineage. It's a 15-year-old bourbon created by the father and son team of Fred and Freddie No. There's also a new 7-year-old bottled and bond edition of Old Grandad that comes from barrels filled in the spring of 2018. And Knob Creek is re-releasing its bourbon and rye Kentucky Straight blended whiskey. It blends Knob Creek 9-year-old bourbon and 7-year-old rye whiskeys and sells for $44.99 a bottle. Speaking of Old Forester is releasing the latest edition in its 117 series of whiskeys. It's a re-release of Old Forester Extra Extra Old, which first came out in 2021. It takes the 1910 Old Fine whiskey and gives it an extended finishing period in new oak. It's available at the Old Forester Distillery in Louisville and select Kentucky retailers for $64.99 a bottle. I received a sample this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it in a few minutes. Suntory Global Spirits has launched this year's Lafroig Kerchis single malt in the U.S. The cask-strength version of Lafroig L'Or was originally released at the Isla Festival in May. It'll sell for $110 a bottle in the U.S. Once again, I'll have my tasting notes for it in a few minutes. New York City's Great Jones Distillery is releasing its first wheated bourbon. It's a 4-grain bourbon blending corn, red winter wheat, rye, and malted barley, and is matured for 4 years. It'll carry a recommended retail price of $44.99 a bottle. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society is making its whiskeys available to non-members for the first time. The Society has created a drop and dram tasting pack that includes 3 samples of Society-selected whiskeys. A Speyside named Hunky and Chunky, a Highland single malt named Let's Head for the Lobby, and Isla is represented with the Ultimate Nuance. The packs cost $55 each. Society membership is available for an extra $50. Isle of Arran has released the 3rd edition in their signature series. Duero Discovery is a 12-year-old single malt that spent its last 6 years maturing in red wine casks from Spain's Duero Valley. It's available through Royal Mile Whiskies for £86.95 a bottle. And the Glasgow Distillery Company has released a new Ruby Port Cask Finish single malt. It goes on sale this Wednesday for £57 a bottle and will be available soon in Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Czechia, Switzerland, Denmark, and Belgium. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the calendar now and see what's happening in the world of whiskey. Belfast Whiskey Week is underway with events all week long around Belfast, Northern Ireland. The Top Shelf Whiskey Festival is this Friday night in Canberra, Australia, followed on Saturday by the Whisky Show Canberra. Saturday also brings Peat or No Peat, a whiskey experience at the Castle in Rochester, Minnesota. Tickets are still available for the Compass Box blending session at the Whiskey Exchange's London Bridge shop on July 31st, and the Whisky Show Brisbane is August 9th in Brisbane, Australia. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. Japanese whiskey began with Shinjiro Tori's vision to reflect the true nature and spirit of Japan. The House of Suntory was founded on these principles, guided by generations of craftsmanship that have transformed time, nature, and precision into something greater than the sum of its parts. Pure waters from the mountains of Hakushu, Mizunara oak shaped by decades of patience, a blending philosophy rooted in harmony. These aren't just techniques, they're a way of thinking, a quiet pursuit of balance and depth. From the layered complexity of Yamazaki to the crisp vibrancy of Hakushu and the elegant artistry of Hibiki, every whiskey is a reflection of where it comes from and the hands that shape it. House of Suntory. This is Japanese whiskey.
Enjoy responsibly. Suntory Whiskey Single Malt and Blended Japanese Whiskey. 43% alcohol by volume. Copyright 2025 Suntory Global Spirits Import Company, Chicago, Illinois.
You might expect a book titled The Whiskey Bible to take its subject seriously, and author Noah Rothbaum has done just that. In 600 pages, he takes us through the history of whiskey around the world, giving us a user's guide to our favorite drink. Noah has written several books about whiskey, including The Art of American Whiskey and The Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails. He's recently joined Men's Journal magazine as its spirits editor and is a former Daily Beast editor as well. Noah joined me on a Zoom call this week. It seems like you put a lot of work into this book how long did it take you to write it?
This one was fairly quick for me, so it only took about a little bit less than, I guess a little bit over 5 years. So for me, that's fairly quick. The last book, The Oxford to Companion to Spirits, that I edited with Dave Wondrich took 10 years, although I only really worked on it for 8 years. So I feel like I'm getting quicker as the books go on. So
it's really a complete comprehensive look at the world of whiskey. You've done a great job with it.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot coming from you. So, you pour your heart and soul into a project, and then you remember at the end that you have to share it with the world, and you just hope and pray that people find it interesting and helpful and relevant, and that, I was really trying to find stuff that, wasn't in every whiskey book, and really kind of, look at primary sources, turn over every rock, double check everything that we think we know about whiskey. And to be honest, it was an incredibly humbling process, because so much of what I thought I knew, or what I thought I knew was correct, turned out actually not to be true. And, collectively, for years, decades, we've all got it wrong. But hopefully this book helps set the record straight.
Such as, give me some examples. What do we have wrong that...
Again, this isn't you or me per se. This is the whiskey world. So, for one thing, the idea of, when does American whiskey start being aged in a new barrel, right? You ask different folks, you get many different answers from, my family's always been doing this for hundreds of years, or the 60s when Congress codifies, bourbon, the rules of making bourbon. But it turns out, in fact, this plays out on the halls of Congress right after Prohibition's repealed, because the government is creating new standards of identity. And also they're trying to figure out, most importantly, when and how they should tax the distilling industry. And at that moment, the then called FAA, the Federal Alcohol Administration, a precursor to our modern TTB, decides to write a definition that says that you can only use new barrels for bourbon and rye, which at the time turned out to be, why they did that was because the Coopers had already lost the beer producers, because beer had switched to using steel kegs. And also bourbon benefits from being aged in new wood oak, where rye, as the article that I found this in said, that it can make it taste like turpentine, right? So, it was a way for the bourbon producers and the rye producers, who were intense rivals. We now think of it as this very amicable, rye and bourbon being produced by the same people, and they're both wonderful spirits. But at the time, it was very, very contentious between bourbon and rye producers. And this was a way for bourbon producers to get an edge over their rye rivals. And it's funny, I found this article not in a food section or a whiskey column, but this was in a column about politics in the Beltway in DC. And this plays out for years, because the rye producers, of course, fight back. They want, to be able to use, use barrels. And, sort of keeps going back and forth where ultimately the bourbon producers prevail, um, requiring that bourbon and rye and, has to use new oak barrel, which, I mean, it's a fascinating look into the industry. And also sometimes now what we see is a signature of flavor or a hallmark of a certain region, which creates a certain type of flavor, really has to do with things like taxation and regulations. The same sort of thing happens in Ireland where, now, a hallmark of Irish whiskey is that it uses malted and unmalted barley. Distillers in Ireland started doing that because they were beginning to be taxed by how much malted barley they use. So in order to lower their tax bill, they started using unmalted barley, right? Which obviously had a drastic effect upon how the whiskey tasted, but that wasn't their main concern. Their main concern was obviously lower their production costs, which more than valid. But it's just funny, like in our modern world looking back, we often see these things as a conscious decision or decision regarding flavor or character. And in fact, sometimes they were very practical. Somebody like Macallan has very small stills, where Glenmorangie has very tall stills in Scotland. And it turns out that, in Scotland, distillers, when they set up a new distillery, they would often buy their stills secondhand. So, why this still was smaller or this one was taller, we don't know. Obviously, that then became the house style of that single malt. But really, originally it was a way to save money. It was kind of like how Tony Bourdain in his books would tell folks, if you're going to open a restaurant, don't buy new equipment, buy used equipment. It's the same thing that distillers were doing, in the 1800s to lower their costs.
And sometimes they just had to get a smaller still to fit under the roof.
Exactly. It was totally right. It's, their barn could only take a still that was so high, or they only had so much room. So they needed that kind of setup. And, looking back now, it seems like this conscientious decision or conscious decision that then, led to a certain type of whiskey. But at the time, it was just because the roof was too low. You know what I mean? Like for a bigger still. So it's just all of these types of things, you start looking back and, you want that document to look at that document to quote it in the book, or you just want to double check X or Y, and you realize, whoa, like nobody ever talked about, all this other stuff, like there's a debate, at least in America, that fortunately you don't hear that often anymore about, Jameson being for Protestant drinkers, Bushmills being for Catholics, right? It's something that people in Ireland never really discuss, right? And I looked into that for the book too. And there are some jokes and there are obviously some boycotts during the Troubles, but it was not anything like we made it out to sound in America. And what's even more interesting is that John Jameson himself was Scottish, right? And Protestant, and was even more fascinating, married into one of the most famous Scotch producing families. So, and that's a whole other, story about his wife's family. And basically, they, ultimately their distillery is Cameron Bridge, which is what Diageo still uses to make all of their, grain whiskey. So it's all of these things that we think are these disparate, different kind of stories all kind of tie together, where suddenly you have John Jameson and his wife, Margaret Haig, who's obviously, part of the Haig family, right? Haig and Haig, which is a giant Scotch company. And nobody ever talks about that. And then when you think about it even more, the Irish distillers, refused to make blended whiskey, right? And that almost doomed them, that decision. But Jameson's wife and her family embraced grain whiskey and blended whiskey. And they had, before Aeneas Coffee's design, they had Stein's design for continuous column still, which they used at their distillery. So it's like, I mean, it's really interesting when you think that John Jameson, his wife, basically refused to make blended whiskey, and her family embraced it and were some of the innovators leading that whole charge. And it's like, those were the types of epiphanies that often happened late at night or early in the morning, and my mind's exploding. And it's like, who can I call that's up who would understand the significance of these types of things? It's just like, oh my God, like, am I going crazy, or is this like actually like right? Because it overturns everything that we thought we knew. And the funny thing is that a lot of this book was written during the pandemic, and since libraries were closed, so many of them put their collections online or digitized books, magazines, newspapers. So, for the first time ever, I had access to all of these new sources of information. It was, I mean, to be honest, almost overwhelming, where, it turns out that a lot of academic libraries, Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, had all types of papers that people have donated over the years, including, you know, uh, like handbooks created by whiskey brands, and, you know, their own kind of textbooks. Obviously, Seagram's, many people have seen one of the Seagram's textbooks, but there are even more of those. And some of the people who wrote those textbooks wrote other books. So, I mean, it went from almost having too little sources and knowledge a few years ago, where it was very hard to find this kind of information, to suddenly being overwhelmed with new information, and not all that's correct just because it's old, but so suddenly figuring out, sorting through all of this stuff, and sometimes felt a little bit like, I don't know, the Matrix or something, where you're, am I going crazy, or is this like, did I find some kind of groundbreaking, thing? And to be honest, a lot of the times, you know, uh, when I did discover something totally new, that often what I would thought would have been like a day or half a day or an afternoon's worth of research or writing suddenly turned into a 2-week project, where trying to confirm those things, or trying to find the primary source, and just keep digging and digging and digging until at least you've confirmed that that's accurate. So, I mean, it was an amazing experience and opportunity to write the Whiskey Bible.
And a lot of the history has been lost over the years, largely because we tell a lot of American whiskey history from the Kentucky perspective, when there really is a lot
Oh
more
yeah.
wider perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the whole, there's a section here about Peoria, Illinois in the book, which for many, many years was, the whiskey capital of the US. I mean, if you tell people that, they're like, wait, what? Like, what are you talking about? And it's true. And that,
Mhm.
I think we've forgotten so much of whiskey history for one reason or another. But I mean, the Peoria part really brought home to me the fact that, like, what we consider whiskey history is often very, very limited, or, what we think is a signature style or production method turns out to be the production method of just one brand, or how things were made today, but not how things were made, in the past. And it's even funny. It's like, you know, a lot of brands like to say that they've never changed anything, that they make their whiskey exactly the way that they always have, same recipe, same distillery. And it's like, almost universally, that's not true, right? Obviously, grains have changed greatly. Yeast strains have changed. Water, the way that water is treated has changed, but also really the production methods have changed drastically. And, one of the craziest things that happened while writing this book, and I feel very fortunate that it did, although at the time it was a little stressful, was Todd Leopold and his three-chamber still opening in Denver. And, you know, I have to admit, when Todd first, said that he was recreating a, three-chamber still, he's having Van Dome doing it, I thought it was really cool. I thought it was like a novel idea, but I did not really understand the incredible significance of it. And in fact, the chamber still, or the log still, which was literally made out of a log, is what allowed America and Canada to make a whiskey that was finally unique and distinct from what was being made in Scotland and Ireland, right? And what's interesting is that it turns out that we always knew that some of the original whiskey distillers in the US and Canada, in North America, were farmers, but they also were cattle ranchers, right? They ran feedlots. And the whiskey business was kind of a side hustle to a side hustle, right? So, you had the farm and, you had the leftovers feeding the cattle, right? And then the leftovers from the whiskey business making whiskey, just like today, was fed to the cattle too, right? So you're getting this, the dung from the cattle helps to fertilize the grain. The grain is turned into whiskey. The leftovers from the whiskey are fed to the cattle. Sometimes the grain is fed to the cattle, and then because the cattle was so important, we like to distill in America and originally in Canada with everything in the still, right? In Scotland and Ireland, they filter out the solids, right? It's much easier to distill. It's cleaner. It's easier. It makes a whiskey, it's a delicious whiskey. But in America, we distill with everything in it because it's better for cattle feed. Even that epiphany took a long time. And that's something that, like, Dave Weinrich and I, went back and forth a lot, looking for sources and like double checking. And it turns out that cattle can't really, the feed, it's better if it's not as rich, right? If they've taken out some of the richness. I remember Jim Koch from Sam Adams once telling me they'd made one of their Utopias beers or something, and they sent this like super rich leftovers to a farmer, and the cows were all getting hideously sick. And the farmer's like, "What did you send us?" And it turned out because it still had so much nutrients in it, and cattle prefer things that have less nutrients. I mean, to be honest, I never thought I'd be ever in my life be so excited about learning about cattle or raising cattle or farming practices. I'm a city boy, right? I've never raised cattle. But so it turns out that, of course, by distilling the grain and feeding them this spent grain, it's much better for the cattle. The problem with making the whiskey is that you burn the grain in the still. So American whiskey had a horrible reputation in the UK and in Europe for tasting burnt, right? And obviously nobody talks about that. And the way to get around that was using this newfangled technology called steam and making, chamber stills at first out of like actually a log and then wooden slats, then copper. One chamber turns into multiple chambers, which is essentially how we get the three-chamber still. And while Todd is correct that it was used widely by rye producers, also widely used by bourbon producers, which we forget. And in fact, Kentucky whiskey was originally called log and copper whiskey, the log being a log still or chamber still, and then where the first distillation would take place. And then the second distillation would take place in a small copper pot still. All of that, if you had told me any of this 5 years ago, I would have thought that none of this was true. Right? That this was, I would never, I mean, I'd never heard really any of this. I mean, I'd heard about like wooden stills.
Yeah.
But I wasn't really sure why we used them, how widely they were used, or their effect upon like whiskey history. And it turns out to be this incredibly important stage in American whiskey history. And ultimately, I believe like even things like the Lincoln County process, folks like George Dickel and Jack Daniels both were made on chamber stills originally. And that's probably why they used the Lincoln County process, the charcoal filtration, because those stills were harder to control and you had to remove perhaps certain heavier like flavor compounds from the spirit. Um, so it's really I mean, but it's like fascinating. It's like today, Jack Daniels doesn't really probably need to do the charcoal filtration. Dickel does because their column still doesn't have the stripping portion of the still. So it in many ways mimics the heavier spirit coming off a column still. I mean, off of a chamber still instead of a column still. But like, I mean, all of that again has been sort of lost to whiskey history as things have been streamlined and, production methods have been modernized.
You highlight some of the key figures in whiskey history. One
Yeah.
of them I wanted to mention was Harvey Wiley.
Well, thank you I appreciate that you wanted to highlight him because he's one of my heroes. I think he's one of the people that we have to thank for modern whiskey, or that we have whiskey at all in this country, and is often so overlooked. And Dr. Harvey Wiley was the chief chemist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I think, basically from from 1883 to 1912, and it's sort of like the precursor now to the FDA. And his role was, essentially making sure that what we ate and drank was safe. And, he's one of the chief people behind the U.S., the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And at the turn of the century, food safety is a huge issue. I'm sure many folks had to read Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, in high school about the horrors of the meat industry in America. And, this was like a really hot button issue because at the time, like we were developing technologies that would allow, us to like what they would say, like unsour milk, right? Or take bad meat and make it supposedly edible again, right? And some of these practices were really nefarious, like chocolates being coated with different types of things that were poisonous, right? So like, yeah, like the chocolate might not melt, but like, all these kids would get really sick from eating it. And Dr. Wiley, while he oversaw all of these different types of food and drinks, beverages, his personal passion was rye whiskey, right? And he was a whiskey drinker and he started really getting into it. And at the time, you had this sort of battle between folks who were making whiskey like E.H. Taylor, like in methods that we would recognize today, right? Where, all of the color comes from the barrel, was importance of trying to keep in all of the flavor compounds. And then there were other people on the other side who were basically using neutral grain spirit, flavoring with all types of things like, creosote and, burnt almond, like, nutshells and I mean, a really crazy list of ingredients. In fact, if you look in the back of some of the cocktail books from the time, like I think there's an appendix in William Cocktail Boothby's book. He was a bartender in San Francisco. There's a whole list of recipes for making spirits that all start with essentially neutral grain spirit. And you're adding all types of things to make Monongahela rye, bourbon, Scotch, all this stuff. And, Wiley suspected, that I think he would say like almost like, something like 85% of all whiskey sold in America was like sort of this fake whiskey, right? That it wasn't good. And, if you really think about that, it's kind of crazy that he was fighting, he and just a few distillers are really fighting for the soul of American whiskey. And he's fortunate that he finds a sympathetic ear in Teddy Roosevelt who was the president then, and also his attorney general, a man named Bonaparte. And Wiley's able to get them to, essentially agree with him and pass regulations and standards for the production of whiskey, which totally upsets major players, including Canadian Club, who later publishes basically a little manifesto book, venting their side of the argument. And when it's published, they send it to Wiley and they say we're going to publish this. What do you think? And he writes back a letter being like, I encourage you basically to tell the world your opinions. And they reprint his letter in the front of the book, which is pretty hilarious. And I found that in, I think, USC's library, right? It has this crazy long title. It almost sounds like something that, some screed that somebody would put up on Reddit today, venting about how the government was trying to prevent them from making whiskey. And, the feud between Wiley and Canadian Club gets particularly contentious, where at a certain point they even confiscate cases of Canadian Club in Detroit as it's coming over the river because, it's labeled as whiskey, but for a short period of time, according to Wiley's regulations, it would not be considered whiskey because it included either, I guess they said that it was essentially a lightly flavored, neutral grain spirit, essentially, from what I remember, where, they're blending, straight whiskey with sort of a grain whiskey. And for Wiley, that violated his regulations. Ultimately, sort of sadly, Teddy Roosevelt steps down or is no longer president, and William Howard Taft is elected president. And then Taft comes in and he has way more sympathetic to all whiskey producers and essentially issues, I guess using an executive order, my editor was like, how did he make this pronouncement? I was like, I don't know. He was the president. He made this pronouncement basically saying whiskey's whiskey. So no matter how it's made, it's whiskey. So if it's, if it's a blend, it's whiskey. If it's straight whiskey, it's whiskey. If it's, essentially, imitation whiskey, it's still whiskey, which was very unsatisfying, obviously, to Wiley and all of these, all the whiskey producers who sided with him. The one thing that Taft, of course, outlines that's not whiskey is whiskey made from molasses, right? You could make it out of molasses. That's where they drew the line, which is also interesting because in the UK, right around the same time, they had a royal commission on spirits too, which lasts several years, which is fascinating testimony from all the major producers. And the ruling of the Royal Commission is equally kind of, I don't know, amorphous, which also basically says whiskey's whiskey unless it's made from molasses, which sounds crazy. But when you actually look back in Scotland, even they were using molasses sometimes as the base of their so-called whiskey. So, I mean, at least the one good that came out of these sort of middle of the road rulings was that whiskeys could be made from molasses, but everything else essentially was allowed. Wiley, he and Taft obviously did not see eye to eye on many things, so he steps down. E.H. Taylor tries to hire him, says, look, come work for me. I love what you were, what you're doing. Come work for me. And Wiley decides not to, and then ultimately works at Good Housekeeping's lab for several years. But again, I mean, I think his work is really interesting, and there's a book about him in that time period, I think, called The Poison Squad, which is fascinating that people can get more info on. But Wiley is the type of person who's essentially been written out of history, but also incredibly vindicated, because essentially modern drinkers, it's exactly what we want, right? We want all the We want all the color to come from the barrel, right? You're not allowed to add any coloring. Like, all the flavor comes from these flavor compounds that are created during the fermentation process, right? And kind of augmented during the distillation process, right? And the aging process, right? So it's distilling and maturation in its purest form, and that's essentially became the hallmark of the American whiskey industry. We always think that's how it was, but in fact, for a few years there, it seemed like it wasn't going to be like that at all. It's only like that because of the result of Dr. Wiley and his vision and his taste for whiskey.
You have a whole section in the book on Japanese whiskey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's also one of the more surprising things that I thought I knew the whole story of Japanese whiskey, and it turns out I did not. And reading English language newspapers from Japan, I found an archive, was fascinating, an insight into really understanding the history of Japanese whiskey. And the modern, I assume you're alluding to the modern scandal of folks finding out that some Japanese whiskeys included whiskey made outside of the country. And in fact, the laws or I mean, there really aren't laws essentially in Japan. I mean, there are suggested regulations from their association, but it allowed Japanese producers to bottle whiskey, whether it was produced in Japan or outside of Japan, as Japanese whiskey, right? Up until recently. Now they're trying to create like standards, for there's now a standard that if it's Japanese whiskey, it should say Japanese whiskey, members of the association. It's not legally binding, but if you want to be, but the way that it was framed, not by the distillers, but I'd say by journalists in the US and the UK and around the world, or at least this is how we all thought it went, was that Japanese whiskey got so popular, demand outstripped supply, so they started to augment supply with whiskey made in other countries. And it was like a stopgap measure.
Right.
That turns out not to be actually accurate at all. And in fact, for decades, the Japanese whiskey industry has been buying whiskey from Scotland and other places in bulk, partially because the tariffs, were so high to import bottles versus bulk whiskey. But that really, for decades and decades, the Japanese have been blending Scotch and other types of whiskey into their own whiskey. So much so that, in my book, there's a lot of uproar when Seagram's buys Glenlivet, because Suntory owns part of Glenlivet at the time. And there are a lot of articles in the UK press about what will happen if Suntory can no longer get access to Glenlivet to use in its products. And then there are other, in the same time period, I think in the 70s, there was lots of articles about how, that this is probably very problematic, selling bulk Scotch to the Japanese market to basically improve their products. And the person who wrote this opinion piece was basically, and I forgot what he says, but he almost has it perfectly. In 30 years, we're going to really regret this. And he was almost, it's very close to being right, in his time period, because ultimately, yes, and to be fair, I think a lot of this had to do with us, our understanding. And I don't think, if anything, this wasn't a secret because it was out in the open, right? People in Scotland knew this. The brands knew it. In fact, I think the Scotch market or the whiskey market in Japan kind of crashes 10 years after it does in the US. So the crash in Japan in the 80s, I think, really is the final straw that for Scotch distillers where they realize, okay, we're single malt makers. We've just lost Japan. We've already lost like kind of America in terms of blends. We've got to reformulate and reintroduce ourselves as single malts, right? So that's almost the final thing that happens to spur single malt producers in Scotland to bottle their products as a distinct product, because ultimately the blenders and even the bulk market in Japan falls apart. So that's really, again, all of these things, like working on this book that I thought were completely separate industries, separate stories, like some kind of like Agatha Christie novel. All of these things keep crossing over each other, right? And again, I mean, I think it's one of these things where when Japanese whiskey got really hot over the last 15 years, we thought about it in terms that we think of Scotch or American whiskey, and nobody really thought about it the way that they've been making whiskey for decades, right? And the way that they've been making whiskey for decades has been kind of making these world blends. Not all the whiskeys, but many of them. So, it's one of these things where, when this came out again, it was framed as like a scandal. But, in retrospect, I think the Japanese were like, I mean, they didn't say this, but like they had been doing this for decades, and it wasn't really a new thing. It was just that we didn't realize it. But it's really fascinating to look back at, how interconnected the Japanese whiskey industry is with the Scotch whiskey industry, even to this day. And like, ultimately at first, the Scotch industry, like, people were like, just as like, Dalwhinnie around the turn of the century is bought by an American company. It's a giant scandal in the UK with articles written about it. And what's interesting about my book is that like I've broken it up into the major distilling regions and kind of history, production styles, and then there's what I call family trees instead of tasting notes for each, so that you get to understand that like, all of these brands are in the same family, and something like Dalwhinnie, I go into the history of that distillery, and it is interesting that like it seemed like such a scandal, and in some ways the same thing happens later when some of the Japanese spirits companies start to consider buying Scotch distilleries, and ultimately they do, right? And that's this was sort of these sort of secret things or things that were said sort of in a whisper, but like turn out to be, if you look back in the newspaper about the use of foreign whiskey and Japanese whiskey, turn out to be fairly accurate. Like obviously each distillery makes their own whiskeys in their own way, but overall there's a lot of foreign whiskey entering Japan.
So what's next?
Well, for me, this book comes out, the Whiskey Bible comes out on September 9th. Be available all over. The bartender, Kenta Goto, from Bar Goto and Bar Goto Niban. Kenta, for many years, ran Audrey Saunders' pioneering bar, Pegu Club on Houston Street in New York. Kenta and I are writing a book together about his cocktail recipes and his bartending philosophies, which will hopefully be out in the fall of 2026, which seems both very far away and also not that far away at all. And then also at the same time, I recently took a position at Men's Journal as their spirits editor. So I oversee all of their spirits and beverage coverage, as well as write the weekly Whiskey Wednesday newsletter. So it's just folks subscribe to that.
Which I do.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, and then through the fall, we'll be doing a whole bunch of different events about the Whiskey Bible. I feel like you and I have talked about some of my favorite parts, but really I learned so much, and there's so much in this book, so much that was sort of embarrassingly hiding in plain sight, and stuff that I wish I had looked into years before, certainly, would have been helpful for previous projects or stories to have known the full truth. But I mean, there's so much in it, and I kind of feel like it's the type of book, it follows in the series, in Karen McNeil's, very, very important book, The Wine Bible, which came out 25 years ago. So Workman put out The Wine Bible, which I think really changed the world. And I remember getting my first copy, which I still have, which is full of Post-it notes, and thinking, my God, like, how did Karen McNeil do this? This is so impressive. I am so intimidated by the wine world, which has definitely convinced me that I should not write about wine.
Yeah.
And then about 15 years later, Workman added the Beer Bible, and then they decided that, okay, we want a Whiskey Bible to round out the series. So this trinity of these three books. So I'll be doing a whole bunch of events this fall, supporting the Whiskey Bible. So look out for that. But yes, thank you so much for having me on, Mark. It's always a pleasure.
Are you expecting any blowback from fans of Jim Murray?
I mean, I hope not. I mean, I think the two books are very, very different. Jim Murray, obviously for many years, wrote his own Whiskey Bible, which is also called Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible. So I think that is very distinct. It's, his ratings and opinions about whiskeys. This book is obviously, there are no ratings. There are not traditional tasting notes, which is what Jim specializes in. It's more about history, production style, house style, the history. And again, the title of this book is because of the Wine Bible and the Beer Bible and Workman's series. I'm not sure that they even knew that there was another Whiskey Bible before I brought it up to them. But that this is, this follows in their series of books. So, and which has been around since 2000. So, I could see them expanding it even further if they wanted to into other, beverage categories. I would certainly love one on, I don't know, Cognac Bible. I mean, I'm not the person to write that, but I think a lot of other spirit categories would benefit, and other drinks categories from this kind of treatment. So yeah, I mean, it's completely distinct and different than what Jim Murray does, and they don't look alike. Obviously, his name is in the title of his book, so people, if they want that book, or they can still easily find it, I imagine.
Noah Rothbaum's The Whiskey Bible will be published on September 9th. We have a link for more details in the show notes for this episode at WhiskyCast.com. Thanks to Noah Rothbaum for joining us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with something unusual, a bottled in bond American single malt from Colorado's Root Shoot Spirits. It's a 4-year-old single malt bottled at, of course, 50% ABV. The nose is malty and rich with barley sugar, honey, brown sugar, and caramel. The taste is creamy and smooth with notes of cherry cola, black pepper, honey, and barley sugar, while the finish is long with a lingering pepperiness. I'm scoring the Root Shoot Spirits American Single Malt a 92. Next up, let's look at the 2025 Old Forester Extra Extra Old Bourbon I mentioned during the news. It's bottled at 46.5% ABV, and the nose has touches of charred oak, vanilla, caramel, honey, and subtle spices. The taste is not subtle, though. It's peppery with cinnamon, black pepper, and allspice notes, balanced by honey, vanilla, and oak tannins. The finish is long and spicy. I'm scoring the 2025 Old Forester Extra Extra Old Bourbon a 93. Finally, let's take a look at the Laphroaig 2025 Kerchis Lohr Cask Strength. It's bottled at 59.6% ABV. The nose has classic Laphroaig notes of peat, creosote, and iodine, along with sea salt, honey, and vanilla. The taste has notes of peat smoke, peppercorns, honey, creosote, and iodine, while the finish is long and peppery with a nice peatiness. I wish they'd make a lower cask strength part of the regular Laphroaig range, but this will have to do for now. I'm scoring it a 94. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,900 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
Dewar's 19-Year-Old Champions Edition is more than just exceptional whiskey. It's a tribute to the U.S. Open Championship. Each year's limited edition release is crafted to honor the host course, integrating its spirit through a unique cask finish. For the 2025 tournament at Oakmont in Pennsylvania, Dewar's continues this tradition with an exceptional 19-year-old whiskey, double-aged, then finished in a way that nods to Pennsylvania's long-standing connection to apple brandy. Created by six-time Master Blender of the Year Stephanie McLeod, this year's edition is finished in Calvados apple brandy casks, imparting layers of green apples, apricots, citrus, warm spice, and a touch of honey. This isn't just a tribute, it's a masterclass in blending. Seek it out, savor every drop, and trust me, you'll be glad you did. Please enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2025, Dewar's is a trademark. Imported by John Dewar & Sons Company, Coral Gables, Florida. Blended Scotch whiskey, 43% alcohol by volume.
Let's open up the inbox now and see what people are talking about this week in our community segment. After I posted the news about Killarney Brewing and Distilling going into receivership this week, we had several comments. Christopher Glenn posted this note in the WhiskyCast community app. More unfortunate news, and what a beautiful distillery they had built there. I've not had the chance to try their stuff, but as with all these similar stories, I hope they can find a path forward. And Whiskey Oracle responded with this. That's a shame, a sad day for the industry. Ireland is really struggling with more and more distilleries going out of business. In 20 years, alcohol consumption has dropped by a third in Ireland, which is staggering. And Canuck Sloth chimed in with this comment. Ireland having only 5 million people really makes it hard to overcome shifts in the market. Then add in less people are drinking or drinking less. One aspect I'm curious about is on the volume brands being impacted, in part due to the high cost of drinks going to events. It's $10 to $15 a drink locally where I am, and in places like Vegas, many of the venues, it's $20 to $30. I'm wondering if Ireland and the UK have similar prices. 25 years ago, $2 to $5 drinks were normal, and now it's 3 to 5 times that. Well, I'll defer to our listeners in Ireland and the UK for the answer to that question. Share your comments in the free WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from your app store. We're also on social media. Look for WhiskyCast on X, Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, and Threads. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. Distillers have faced the problem of what to do with their leftovers for generations. Most of the time, the spent grains or stillage left from the distillation process have been dried and used to feed livestock. Now, a Kentucky biotech company is teaming up with Buffalo Trace to use its leftovers to make so-called alternative proteins. Meridian Biotech will build a $40 million facility near Buffalo Trace to process the distillery's waste. Brandon Saras is Meridian's CEO.
Primarily, it makes up of 99% water, so it's able to be pipelined to our facility. What we will then do is we have multiple manufacturing buildings that we will be processing this into number of different products, and those products go into their alternative proteins, but they've got multifunctional benefits. So essentially, we would be a processing facility. Same thing as you look at a distillery. They have fermenters. We do things a little different. It's a bioprocessing facility. So essentially, it comes into our facility. The products are then dried at our facility, so it comes in powder form.
And what can it be used for?
A number of different benefits. Most of the ones that we're processing here, these will be into alternative proteins. They serve multifunctional benefits into the pet food markets, the aquaculture, so farm raised. We have customers there that are looking at it not only from a protein standpoint, but what are some of the added benefits? And we've done worked with a lot of universities on these trials, numerous publications. And then our other products, we've got a product that is a high phosphorus fertilizer. We're working recently on a project, essentially a testing with University of Kentucky here, where they did a trial on winter wheat. So we're hoping to keep that here in the state, in the western part of Kentucky. So they're being utilized as a byproduct, but essentially we're increasing the value, increasing the protein, and there's other uses of it. Right now, the spent grain model for most of these distilleries, it goes to cattle feed. So I think that's what the industry is looking for, other alternatives, something that can be processed into a more sustainable ingredient.
Meridian recently won a pitch competition sponsored by the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet and the Cabinet for Economic Development, looking for new ideas to deal with distillery waste in a sustainable way. Construction is expected to begin on Meridian's plant this fall. If there's something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, and of course a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us, download the free WhiskyCast community app from your app store, or find us on social media. We're on Blue Sky, X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, and our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Discover the 2025 limited release of Dewar's 19-Year-Old Champions Edition, finished in Calvados apple brandy casks, a perfect fusion of craftsmanship and tradition. Here's to great whiskey and the game that inspires it.
Crafted with time, shaped by nature, perfected by generations. From Yamazaki to Hibiki to Hakushu, every drop of House of Suntory whiskey is a reflection of where it comes from. House of Suntory, this is Japanese whiskey.
Enjoy responsibly. Suntory Whiskey Single Malt and Blended Japanese Whiskey. 43% alcohol by volume. Copyright 2025 Suntory Global Spirits Import Company, Chicago, Illinois.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2025, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.